Ethan was an enigma. Everyone who had ever interacted with him said so. He was strange. The kind of strange one might tolerate at first glance, captivated by the fine lines of his face, but would find unbearable by the third day. He moved through his life alone, a gray and white striped canvas backpack slung over his shoulder, clad in monochromatic, loose-fitting hoodies and jeans. His daily path was a straight line between the law school and the main campus library. There was a wide, tree-lined avenue connecting the 2 points, and Ethan always appeared at the same time, his pace steady and unhurried. With headphones in his ears, he stared straight ahead, oblivious to the world, regardless of the weather. On the surface, this routine seemed unremarkable, but it was his delicately sharp features, which his slightly too long hair couldn't fully conceal, and a slender frame that set him apart from his peers, that drew unwanted attention. And with attention came gossip. Curious students would make the trip from the north side of campus, positioning themselves by the avenue just to intercept him. One such person rushed up to ask for his number. Ethan didn't even break his stride, his face a blank mask as he stated it was not going to happen. The person persisted, and Ethan finally stopped. His voice edged with impatience as he demanded to know why he was being followed. The revulsion in his eyes was undisguised. After a few more such encounters, his reputation as the campus eccentric was solidified. By his sophomore year, people were still pointing and whispering. Those who knew him better, if such a term could be used, confirmed that his coldness wasn't reserved for strangers. It extended to his classmates and even his roommates. He never acknowledged classmates he passed on the quad. He shunned all group activities and joined no clubs. In class, he always occupied the front and center seat, directly facing the lecturer. He spoke to no one, except when forced by the necessity of a group project. His free time was devoted to part-time jobs, a constant hustle for money. He never quite understood why immersing himself in his own world earned him the label of a weirdo, but he didn't particularly care. He was far more concerned with whether his savings account had grown. That evening, he had a tutoring session at 6. A 5th-grade boy needed help with English and math, at a rate of $100 an hour, for 3 hours. The family was generous, and Ethan treated the job with professional diligence. Returning to his dorm to collect his materials, he heard voices from within before he even opened the door. Jake's voice was loud, roughhousing with their other roommate, Leo. He was yelling about not messing with Ethan's things, that Ethan would fix him with that dead-eyed stare of his. Leo let out a cold laugh, retorting that Ethan never even looked at him, let alone stared. He expressed his deep annoyance with Ethan, comparing him to a cursed specter, always appearing and disappearing silently. He recounted how someone had asked him the day before if their roommate Ethan had autism, and how unbelievable it was that anyone would even want his number. Jake conceded that Ethan was, after all, undeniably, but Leo cut him off, questioning what exactly was so undeniable. He personally didn't find him attractive, commenting on how his face was as pale as a ghost's. Just as the words left his mouth, Ethan pushed the door open. Jake and Leo fell silent instantly. Their hearts nearly stopped, but they held their ground, faces stiff, their gazes darting away. Ethan walked straight to his desk without a word. He swapped his law textbooks for the child's workbooks and his own notes. Zipping up his canvas backpack, he turned and left. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds. The moment the door clicked shut, Jake kicked a chair in frustration, muttering about how seeing him was just bad luck. On the subway, Ethan pulled out his phone and scrolled through LSAT vocabulary flashcards. A young man who looked like an alpha sat next to him. Ethan felt the man's gaze repeatedly land on his profile, so he stood up and moved to stand by the doors. His profile was admittedly striking. It was not uncommon for people to stare at him in class. His hair had a natural brown tint and fell to his shoulders, and his skin was as fair as fresh snow. His pupils were a pale amber, giving him a fragile, almost mixed heritage look in the sunlight. He often tied his hair back in a messy, careless half-bun with an elastic band, revealing glimpses of the pale skin of his neck. His face was a study in contrasts. His expressive eyes and long, curled lashes were almost delicate, while the high bridge of his nose and his thin, somewhat severe lips were sharp and defined. A small brown mole near the corner of his left eye served as a focal point, turning the contradiction into a unique, coolly detached charisma. Thanks to this appearance, he had frequently been featured on the campus confessions page when he first started school, a fact of which he remained blissfully unaware. Arriving at the boys' house, Ethan offered his first smile of the day, but it was a fleeting, professional courtesy. He laid out his notes and a practice test. He made an effort to soften his voice, asking if the day's homework was finished. The boy, slightly intimidated by him, nodded obediently. Ethan wasted no more time, placing the test in front of him and stating that he had 30 minutes to complete it before they would review. The boy's cheerful expression immediately fell. The agonizing half-hour finally passed. As Ethan graded the test, he overheard the boy run out to his mother, complaining that Mr. Evans was so mean and that he didn't like him. The mother quickly shushed him, murmuring that Mr. Evans was always praising him and telling him to be good. The boy mumbled that he preferred his old tutor and didn't want Mr. Evans anymore. The red pen in Ethan's hand never paused, marking crosses on the paper. He had long grown accustomed to the fact that he was not naturally likable. After the session, Ethan discussed the boy's academic progress with his mother. During their conversation, he received a text message. 10 p.m., Sterling Hill. Ethan replied, busy. The next day, Ethan woke at 7 as usual. He washed, dressed, and headed to the main library with his canvas backpack. He had no classes that day. While filling his water bottle at the cooler, he overheard two people chatting nearby. They mentioned a club event in the Grand Auditorium that afternoon, sponsored by Sterling Enterprises. Ethan paused for a moment. One of them asked if the other had seen the list for this year's Sterling Scholarship. The other hadn't, but mentioned a friend who had won the top prize last year, $100,000, and was hired by Sterling immediately after graduation. They remarked on how Sterling's constant donations and scholarships were making it seem like they owned the university. The first person thought that was a good thing, citing Sterling's immense wealth and the fact that countless people were desperate to get a job there, while they had direct corporate partnership programs. It was all thanks to the boss's son, they agreed. They were talking about Julian Sterling. One of them had seen him on the basketball court a few days ago and commented on how he stood out, a true top-tier alpha. The other laughed, saying that while alphas were common, a Julian Sterling was rare. Hot water was about to overflow from his mug. Ethan quickly hit the stop button. He returned to his seat and continued reading until 1 in the afternoon. His schedule was as rigid as his class timetable, with no room for deviation. But unexpected events sometimes disrupted his carefully laid plans. At 3:30, he received a message from his class representative. There was a joint law and business school mixer that afternoon, and he was the only one from their class who hadn't checked in. Ethan frowned. He hadn't known about this. He scrolled through the class group chat, which he kept on mute, and found the announcement for what he had assumed was an optional event. He replied, "Okay." The April weather in New Haven was perfect. Leaves rustled, and sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground in gold. Ethan walked toward the business school's conference hall, his head down, focused on stepping only on the patches of light. Took him nearly 10 minutes to arrive. He was unfamiliar with the business school building and had a poor sense of direction. He studied the directory for a long time before figuring out where the entrance was. And still, he got it wrong. He was supposed to enter through the back. Instead, he opened the front door. As he pulled it open, the booming voice of the business school's dean, extolling the virtues of interdepartmental cooperation, filled the air. The door creaked. Every head in the hall turned toward him. A normal person would have been mortified, but Ethan was an enigma. His expression didn't change. He turned, closed the door behind him, and walked calmly inside. He went straight to an empty seat in the second row, on the far right. The moment he sat down, he heard a sharp intake of breath from the row behind him. He glanced to his side. Oh, it was Julian Sterling. Rumor had it that Julian, a junior, was already involved in his family's business. He often wore dress shirts to class and drove a six-figure luxury car. Today, he was in a perfectly tailored white shirt. His long legs, encased in black trousers, were crossed. From Ethan's angle, he could see the polished tip of a very expensive leather shoe. A hand reached out from the back row, passing him a small, folded piece of paper. It read, "Don't sit there. Move." The note explained that the seat next to Julian Sterling was usually kept empty. It wasn't that Julian was elitist, but the space was often reserved for faculty or dignitaries for photo opportunities. As for why Julian needed to be in photos for a school event, it was because any university social media post featuring his face saw its engagement numbers double. The administration was more than happy to be photographed with the future heir of Sterling Enterprises. Ethan read the note and handed it back, remaining seated, as immovable as a statue. The students behind him were stunned. Julian's friend, Rex, couldn't stand it. He muttered under his breath, asking who this guy thought he was. Seeing Ethan's stillness, Rex started to get up, intending to pull him away. The tension in the surrounding area was palpable. Only Ethan remained calm. He even took off his backpack, pulled out an LSAT prep book, and began to flip through it. Someone whispered that he must be that autistic kid from the law school. The one who's got issues. He must be doing it on purpose. Just as Rex was about to move, Julian raised a hand. Rex understood the gesture. It meant either to not be impulsive or simply to let it go. Julian's authority was never questioned. Rex reluctantly sat back down. Ethan didn't like to feel constrained while studying, so as he turned the pages, his elbow encroached on the adjacent armrest. Julian's forearm, which had been resting there casually, was nudged off. Rex, watching from the side, felt his eye twitch. This guy had to be autistic or just plain crazy. Did he have any idea who he was sitting next to? The contrast between them was stark. Ethan's drab gray hoodie seemed even duller next to Julian's crisp white shirt. He sat with his head bowed, his body hunched, as if trying to shrink into the seat. With his bangs obscuring his face, all one could see was a slender frame, with nothing else to commend. And there he sat, brazenly next to Julian Sterling, his equally slouchy canvas backpack at his feet, precariously leaning against Julian's leg. Under the intense scrutiny of the crowd, Ethan finished 3 reading comprehension passages. The moment the applause for the dean's concluding remarks died down, he grabbed his bag, signed the attendance sheet with the class rep, and left. Rex watched his retreating back and mumbled, "What a pretentious jerk." Ethan had dinner at the cafeteria and then returned to his dorm. He had no tutoring that night, so he took a shower. He had just finished when his phone buzzed with a message notification. He glanced at it, put it down, and continued drying his hair. A few minutes later, the phone rang. Ethan seemed to know who it was without looking and didn't answer. He took the hairdryer into the bathroom. His hair was fine and soft and needed to be dried immediately after washing. His dorm was a quad, but one of the original occupants had transferred to computer science their freshman year, leaving just him, Jake, and Leo. The university usually assigned dorms by the 3 secondary genders, but since betas were more numerous, they were sometimes placed with lower-level omegas. Ethan was one such case. These 2 lower-level omegas clearly resented Ethan, who had the face of a high-level omega. Jake's animosity was the most overt, reaching a point where they could barely coexist in the same space. Today, when he pushed the door open, Ethan was in the middle of getting dressed, pulling on a cream-colored hoodie, a departure from his usual grays. Jake paused, then began speaking to Leo, his words laced with sarcasm directed at Ethan. He remarked on how some people were making a name for themselves in 2 different schools and had even managed to offend the campus prince, calling it truly impressive. Ethan acted as if he hadn't heard a thing. He took his textbooks out of his bag, replaced them with his tutoring materials, and headed out again. Jake followed him to the door and kicked it shut behind him. Ethan walked out of the campus gates. He turned right, past a long line of food trucks, and continued to the end of the road. The area was much less crowded. At a corner alley, he saw a black Range Rover. In the fading twilight, it looked surprisingly inconspicuous. Ethan walked over and pulled open the rear door. Before he could let go, he was pulled inside. A familiar scent enveloped him. He didn't even have time to take off his backpack before he was being kissed. His lips first held gently. Then, after a moment's thought, as if the person felt wronged, bitten with force. Ethan couldn't escape. It was only when a hand slid under the hem of his hoodie that he remembered to resist. His fingertips pressed against the man's chest, then slid up to the collar of his shirt, but his resistance was futile, only fanning the flames. Ethan tilted his head back slightly, his breathing gradually sinking with his aggressors. "Why didn't you answer my call?" The voice was low. "I was busy," Ethan said. Julian lifted his head. In the dim light of the car, he looked directly into Ethan's eyes, pressing, "Busy with what?" This version of him was a world away from the one in the conference hall 2 hours earlier. He was looking up at Ethan. "Tutoring," Ethan replied. Julian let out a cold sneer. "That desperate for money?" Ethan didn't respond. He reached into Julian's coat pocket, took out his phone, and unlocked it with a practiced motion. He transferred $2,000 to himself, then put the phone back. He lay back without protest and asked, "Should we start now?" Sometimes Julian really wanted to strangle Ethan. He wanted to see if there would be any flicker of emotion in Ethan's eyes as he was dying. He feared seeing only his own reflection in those placid amber pools. So instead, he bit down on Ethan's slender neck. Ethan instinctively arched his back, like a trapped crane. His lack of struggle only fueled Julian's frustration. He couldn't help but leave a deep mark on that smooth, porcelain-like skin. Ethan was already limp in his arms, every part of him pliant. Even when bitten, he only let out a soft sound, incapable of any real reaction. There had been a tear at the corner of his eye, but when Julian turned to look at him, it was gone. Outside the car window was the deepening twilight. Inside, an intimate storm. Faintly, the sound of students laughing as they passed the alley entrance could be heard, along with the distant honking of rush-hour traffic. The sounds merged, then were swallowed by the small, enclosed space, lost in the meeting of lips and teeth. They became a muted backdrop, keeping Ethan from being too distracted. Even outside of his rut, Julian could unleash the full force of a top-tier alpha's aggression. After every session, Ethan's body was a canvas of purple and blue bruises, some from kisses, others from the grip of Julian's large hands, or from being bumped against the back of the front seats during their more vigorous movements. Because Ethan's skin was so fair, the slightest pressure left a mark. In all, he looked utterly pitiable. Julian felt a pang of remorse, but couldn't bring himself to apologize. Instead, he held Ethan carefully in his arms. Ethan had taken health classes. He knew an alpha's rut and an omega's heat were both biologically uncontrollable. As a beta, he could only try to empathize with the torment of being ruled by instinct. But he truly couldn't understand why Julian was always so ferocious with him. They met at least twice a month, yet every time Julian gave him the sense of an impending apocalypse, a feeling of panic that this would be their last time together. It was a complete mystery to Ethan. The sky darkened until the streetlights came on. A dim, yellow lamp at the alley entrance illuminated the windshield, suddenly bringing everything into focus. Julian kissed a mark on Ethan's shoulder. Neither of them spoke, tacitly enjoying the rare moment of tenderness in the afterglow. The slender beta wasn't soft to the touch, but he had a waist that could be encircled by one hand, and the sharp lines of his scapulae were prominent on his back. His winged shoulder blades, a sign of being underweight, looked strangely captivating on him, holding a fatal allure. When Ethan had his back to him, Julian always felt as if he might take flight at any moment, and so he held him tighter. Now, Julian buried his face in Ethan's chest again. Ethan was speechless. He didn't understand Julian's fixation on that spot. It was only when it started to hurt that he said, "That's enough." Julian stopped. Ethan sat on Julian's lap, staring blankly out the window. After about 30 seconds, he came to his senses. Pushing through the soreness in his body, he reached into the front seat for some wet wipes and cleaned himself up before getting dressed. Julian was watching him. Ethan was immune to his gaze. He found the thin black elastic band from the crevice of the seat, raised his hands to tie back his loose hair, and said nothing. His irises were a pale, unique amber, which always made him look as if he were lost in thought. Julian found it hard to discern his mood and could only provoke him to get a reaction. As he tied his hair, the hem of his hoodie lifted, revealing a sliver of his waist. Julian remembered the feel of his hand gripping it and reached out to touch it. Ethan didn't flinch. Ethan himself couldn't smell it, but he was currently covered in the scent of an alpha's pheromones. The marks on his neck and wrists were too obvious for his hoodie to hide. The intimate warmth lingered in the air. Julian withdrew his hand. Ethan finished tying up his hair and bent down to pick up his canvas backpack. His movements when preparing to leave were always crisp and efficient, as if the person who had been crying for him to stop just moments ago was someone else entirely. Julian finished dressing. He lowered the window a fraction, letting out some of the hot, humid air. The cool night breeze drifted in. Julian fastened the last button on his shirt, a feeling of disappointment undeniable. He had been deluding himself. He had thought that Ethan sitting next to him that afternoon meant something, that it was, at the very least, a small act of affection. He had been so bewitched by the thought that he had ignored their agreed-upon time, ignored the risk of parking so close to the university where they could be recognized. He had been almost desperate, pulling Ethan into the car the moment he appeared. He thought Ethan knew it was his birthday, but the reality was he had been thinking too much. Ethan couldn't possibly care. Yet he still held on to a sliver of hope, waiting through the past 2 hours for a single word, a hesitant phrase, even a brief moment of initiative or a fleeting smile. Anything would have been enough. He would have been satisfied. But Ethan offered nothing. It was the same as every time before. Resistance, annoyance, reluctant submission, forced endurance. "Ethan, do you even have a heart?" Julian reached out and placed his hand over Ethan's chest. He asked again, "Does it ever beat for anything?" Ethan took out his phone and checked the time. "No, it doesn't." Julian laughed at himself. "Is that so?" "Yes." "Is this the first time you've realized?" Ethan put his phone in his pocket and said, "The 2 hours are up. I'm leaving. Where are you tutoring?" "I'll drive you." "No need." Ethan's rejection was swift and clean, making Julian wonder for a moment who was paying whom. Julian watched him go. Ethan's figure quickly vanished at the end of the alley. He always watched Ethan leave like this, from a year ago until this very moment. Felt as if nothing had changed. He turned and lay back on the rear seat, pressing his fingers to his temples. A faint, elusive scent still lingered in the air. Though Ethan was a beta, untouched by pheromones, Julian always thought that if he did have a scent, it would be a poisonous freesia. Subtly intoxicating at first, then hopelessly addictive. By the time he realized it, he would already be terminally ill. Ethan took a winding path through the backstreets near the campus, a single song on repeat for nearly 20 minutes before he finally returned to his dorm. Jake was playing a video game. Hearing the door open, he discreetly took off his headphones and turned the game audio on blast, filling the room with the jarring sounds of virtual combat. Ethan's entire body ached. The evening wind had dissipated the alpha scent from his clothes, but it had also chilled his already sore muscles. He had neither the energy nor the inclination to deal with his antagonistic roommate. He tried to recall the source of their conflict. It seemed to have started right from the beginning of freshman year, when his photos began appearing on the campus confessions page. It was baffling. He put down his backpack, washed up quickly, and climbed into his bunk. A few minutes later, a student from the next room knocked on their door. Standing in the doorway, he asked if they had seen the list for the Sterling Scholarship this year, pointing out that Ethan had received a second-tier award. Leo shot him a look, trying to signal that Ethan was in the room, but the student didn't notice and continued. He went on about how Ethan had really made a scene that day. All the attention at the joint mixer had been on him alone, and Dean Carlson had been furious. He couldn't show it in front of the business school dean and Julian Sterling, but after the event. He had walked off the stage with a grim face and demanded to know which class that undisciplined student belonged to. Jake sneered. The student stepped further into the room, eager to share more gossip. He had heard Ethan had also offended Julian Sterling, a prince-like figure whom nobody dared to cross. The student suddenly noticed the gray and white striped backpack on a chair. His words trailed off. He coughed twice, then looked toward Ethan's bed. The curtain was drawn, but the small bedside lamp was on, indicating someone was there. Just then, Ethan pulled back the curtain and sat up slightly, looking down at the student. His brown hair was pushed back behind his ears, revealing his entire face. The student flinched. He had never actually looked at Ethan directly before. The few times they had passed on the stairs, Ethan was always looking down, his features hidden by his long hair. He always wore baggy clothes, giving an impression of being nothing more than thin and pale. Combined with the grim rumors circulating about him, the student had always imagined Ethan must look like a specter. But now he was completely stunned. The soft light from the lamp cast a hazy glow on Ethan's delicate features. He looked entirely different from the person in the auditorium that afternoon, possessing an indescribable quality, somewhere between ethereal and demonic. He looked down, his expression neutral, neither angry nor smiling. His voice was as cool as ice, yet held a terrifying calm. "Are you talking about me?" The question was simple. There was no threat in his tone. He showed none of the expected emotion toward someone who had been speaking ill of him behind his back. But the other 3 people in the room held their breath in unison. The student was horrified, his face flushing red. He stammered an apology. No. Ethan didn't press him. The student's teeth were chattering with fear. He bowed his head, babbling incoherently. I am sorry. I'm so sorry. Ethan, I wasn't talking about you. I apologize. Then he fled as if his life depended on it. After dealing with that, Ethan glanced at Jake. For some reason, Jake's hand on the mouse twitched, and he instinctively closed the game window. By the time he realized what he'd done, it was too late. He was annoyed, his face turning pale with frustration. Ethan had only looked at him for a second. What was he so afraid of? The noise in the dorm finally ceased, returning to the quiet that Ethan preferred. He closed his curtain and lay back down. He took out his phone to calculate his savings. The Sterling scholarship money would be deposited after the public notice period ended. This month, he had tutored twice and slept with Julian twice, earning a considerable amount. A message from Julian arrived right on cue. It was a transfer notification. Julian had sent him $10,000. Ethan paused, then transferred the money back. Not taking free money, Ethan knew Julian was testing him. He could feel Julian's anger from their time in the car earlier. Isn't the market rate 2,000? He replied. Julian sent no more messages, probably fuming. Ethan moved the money from his Venmo to his bank card, watching the numbers grow, his breathing steadying. Night deepened, and sleepiness crept in. As he turned over, a sharp discomfort lingered between his legs. Julian had been too rough this time, not giving him enough time to relax. A beta, after all, was not an omega, who could easily accommodate an alpha's advances under the influence of pheromones. Especially an alpha as potent as Julian. Apart from an omega whose pheromones were perfectly compatible with his, most people couldn't handle him. If he had pheromones, the thought had barely formed before Ethan extinguished it. He never wasted time on such pointless hypotheticals. In the dead of night, Ethan turned off his bedside lamp. He reached his hand toward his pillow. Next to the down pillow were 2 small, leather-bound boxes, looking like gift boxes. One was old and worn, its sheen long gone from being handled so often. The other was brand new, as if recently purchased. Ethan's long fingers rested on the small boxes, like a child touching a security blanket. He quickly fell asleep. Because of Ethan's market rate comment, Julian didn't contact him for a whole week. Ethan enjoyed the peace and quiet, focusing on preparing for his June LSAT exam. It wasn't that he wanted to go to an elite law school, but he was accustomed to having a goal to work toward, to keep life from becoming too dull. He continued his routine, leaving the dorm at a fixed time, a 10-minute breakfast, a 12-minute walk, and arriving at the library by 8:30, just before it became crowded. He would pick his favorite seat by the window. His academic life was simple. He was emotionally stable and avoided crowds. He could have continued this low-profile existence forever, if not for people who insisted on provoking him. Like Rex, who was now sitting diagonally across from him, spinning a pen and sizing him up with narrowed eyes. Rex's father had reportedly been a minor manager at a logistics subsidiary of Sterling Enterprises. Julian's father had discovered him during a work inspection, was impressed by his work ethic, and promoted him. This single act had lifted Rex's family into a new social class, ensuring they would never have to worry about money again. Rex's father was eternally grateful to the Sterling family, and Rex, in turn, followed Julian like a shadow, his conversations always revolving around him. Rex was decent-looking and had the build of an alpha. Ethan glanced at him once before returning to his practice questions. "I'm curious about you," Rex said. Ethan remained unaffected. "Heard you got the Sterling Scholarship?" Rex suddenly changed the topic, his tone regretful. "Too bad the public notice period is over now." Ethan stopped writing, his pen hovering for a moment before he resumed. "What other scholarships have you applied for?" Rex's implication was clear. He probably saw Ethan's plain clothes and assumed money was his weak spot, using it to taunt him. He wasn't entirely wrong, but no one could threaten Ethan like that. Ethan was silent for a few seconds, then couldn't help but chuckle. He looked up and asked, "Are you trying to stand up for Julian Sterling?" Just because he had completely ignored Julian in the auditorium that day. How ridiculous. Not really. Like I said, I'm just curious about you. You're pretty famous. I've heard about you for a while. Ethan found sycophants like Rex laughable. He also marveled at how the exaggerated side characters in TV shows were indeed drawn from real life. Perhaps Rex truly couldn't comprehend it. How could a universally disliked beta like Ethan, scorned even within his own department, dressed in shabby clothes with hair covering half his face, be so audacious? Despite his undeniably good features, he had a pair of gloomy eyes that made people uncomfortable. There was nothing about him that was easy on the eyes. How could someone like that sit so brazenly next to Julian Sterling, not only pushing aside Julian's arm and kicking his dirty canvas backpack against Julian's feet, but also never once turning his head and leaving whenever he pleased before the meeting was over? He showed no regard for Julian whatsoever. And in doing so, he made everyone else's fawning over Julian look like a joke. "I really want to know," Rex continued, "do people like you just enjoy being different? Get a kick out of people's strange looks? But you know they're all looking at you like you're a clown. Did acting like that in front of Julian make you feel good?" Seeing Ethan's lack of response, and the slight, mocking smile that played on his lips, Rex's anger flared. He slapped the table. Suppressing his rage, he leaned in and said in a low voice, "Looks like your grades are pretty good. Well, here's hoping you can win a few more scholarships. With that money, maybe you can get yourself a new backpack. Carrying around that piece of trash is pretty disgusting." Ethan chuckled softly. "Is that so? Your presence here today is pretty disgusting to me." This was the reaction Rex wanted. He leaned closer to Ethan, enunciating each word. "That's great." The disturbance had already attracted the attention of others in the library. Gazes started to shift their way, and the hushed whispers grew louder. Ethan disliked being the center of attention. He calmly lowered his head and went back to his book. Rex left him with a final parting shot. "Be careful." Ethan thought about his earlier comment about the scholarships and frowned. Rex left. Ethan instinctively reached for his phone, his fingertip hovering over the screen, about to open his chat with that person. But he quickly stopped himself. He couldn't panic. Throughout his life, Ethan had endured a lot of malice, both provoked and unprovoked. He had learned to remain calm and ignore it. But this time was different. Although he knew Rex's mention of the scholarship was just an empty threat, his grades for every course were there in black and white for anyone to see. He still felt a flicker of worry. What if Rex went crazy and sent an anonymous complaint to the president's office, or used his connections to prevent Ethan from receiving the scholarship? Being criticized, ignored, or ostracized was one thing. But if Rex threatened his financial interests, even if there was only a 1 in 10,000 chance, Ethan would have to retaliate. Money was more important to Ethan than his own life. 3 days later, at the Sterling estate, Ethan's arms were pinned behind his back by Julian. The alpha pheromones, which he couldn't sense but still filled him with a primal fear, saturated the room. He was drenched in sweat, biting his lip to keep from making a sound. This time, Julian had given him plenty of time to relax, but Ethan still couldn't handle it. The window was open, and a gentle breeze rustled the white sheer curtains. The flowers and trees in the courtyard outside frequently intruded into his vision, giving him a frantic sense that he was being watched. He turned his head away. He thought to himself, if he ever bought a house, he would install blackout curtains, so no one could see in. Ethan shivered as Julian pressed down on the back of his neck. Betas don't have scent glands, yet Julian still bit down hard. It hurt. It was like being eaten alive. After countless times in bed with Julian, Ethan had come to a conclusion. One cannot defy the laws of nature. Alphas belonged with omegas. At least then, a bite like this would result in a deeper bond, not a bleeding wound that only caused pain. He heard Julian whisper in his ear, "Did you write that anonymous tip to the registrar's office about Rex cheating on his exam?" "Yes." "Did he provoke you?" Ethan suddenly laughed, a quiet, weak laugh that left him breathless. He collapsed onto the bed, his body sinking into the soft silk duvet. Julian licked the small wound on the back of Ethan's neck, letting the bitter, metallic taste of blood spread in his mouth. He only dared to cheat because he knew no one could touch him. "Is that it? Then why did he run to you to complain?" Julian flipped him over. Ethan instinctively avoided his gaze, but Julian cupped his chin and asked, "Why couldn't you run to me and complain?" Oh, so that's what he was angry about. Ethan was truly surprised. Ethan feigned innocence. "He's your childhood friend. And you are..." Julian stopped himself mid-sentence. He released Ethan's chin and said with a cold laugh, "You're someone I pay for. $2,000 a pop." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's right. I'll handle this." Ethan was taken aback for a moment. Then his nonchalant expression returned. "No need. I don't want him to know about our relationship." Before Julian's expression could darken, he raised his hand and rested it on Julian's shoulder, using his fingertip to write on his skin. "I am reporting Rex Johnson, a junior at the business school, for using an electronic device to cheat on the final exam for the securities trading lab last semester." He smiled up at Julian. "I hope the university will investigate the matter thoroughly and punish the student accordingly." "Where did you get the evidence?" "Plenty of places. Rex throws your name around to get his way. A lot of people can't stand him. It just took a little money to get what I needed." Julian shook his head in resignation. He pulled the duvet up to cover Ethan, tucking it around his arms and shoulders as if swaddling a baby. "Next time something like this happens, tell me. I have my ways." Ethan stared at the ceiling, not responding. Julian put on a robe, went to the living room to pour a glass of warm water, and returned to the bedroom. He supported Ethan's back and helped him drink. "Does your neck still hurt?" Ethan shook his head, then nodded, saying with mock gravity, "Mr. Sterling, next time you feel like biting, find an omega. Biting me is useless. Still hurts, doesn't it?" His voice was gentle. Ethan abruptly looked away. He pushed the glass away, feeling a little awkward, and said, "I'm going to take a shower." But Julian simply lifted him out of the blankets and carried him in his arms. Ethan instinctively wrapped his arms around Julian's neck, their faces suddenly very close. The bathtub was filling with hot water. Julian set him down on the bathroom counter and stood in front of him, kissing him. Ethan resisted slightly, but ultimately, he was no match for the alpha who had absolute dominance in the bedroom. His lips were kissed until they were numb, and he was breathless, but Julian didn't let him go. The sound of the running water masked Ethan's gasps. He pushed against Julian, but Julian only pressed closer. Before Ethan could refuse, Julian bit his lip and whispered, "Again." It was a statement, not a request. Where would Ethan find the strength? A beta wasn't an omega, whose body could be easily aroused by pheromones. He had already died once tonight. Plus, the wound on the back of his neck from Julian's grinding teeth was still throbbing. He needed a long time to recover. "It'll cost extra," he said deliberately. Julian was on the verge of exploding. He gripped Ethan's legs, pulling him closer, his voice hoarse as he asked, "How much extra?" Ethan smiled at him. "That depends on how much the client is willing to pay." He insisted on using the word client, deliberately prodding Julian's sore spot. Julian's face changed instantly. He pushed Ethan away abruptly, his eyes cold and filled with disgust. "Shut up." The temperature in the bathroom plummeted. A smile still lingered on Ethan's face, unafraid. Julian had never been able to control Ethan. He stared into Ethan's eyes, which remained as still and calm as ever. Perhaps every word Ethan spoke was from the heart, and his heart was just that cold. He turned and left, closing the bathroom door behind him. Half an hour later, Julian emerged from the guest bathroom, having showered. When he returned to the bedroom, Ethan was curled up under the covers, playing with the tassels on the bedside lamp. He was wearing Julian's pajamas, the oversized sleeves making his arms look thin and bony. He flicked the crystal tassels with his fingertips, like a curious kitten. Julian's heart softened, his earlier anger dissipating in an instant. He got into bed and placed his own phone in Ethan's hand. "You haven't been paid for today." Ethan had been dragged into the bedroom the moment he arrived, with no time to ask for money. He glanced at Julian, then picked up the phone and unlocked it with practiced ease. He opened Venmo, transferred $2,000 to himself. He knew the passcode for that too. The entire process took less than 30 seconds, and the phone was back on the pillow next to Julian. He hadn't even bothered to look at anything else on the screen. Julian chuckled, a mix of amusement and helplessness. He buried his face in Ethan's chest. "These are your own pajamas. Don't blame me if you rip the collar," Ethan mumbled. I won't blame you." By the time Julian was finished, Ethan was already asleep. He was only ever this docile when he was sleeping. He wouldn't say heart-wrenching things. His eyes wouldn't hold that cold expression, and his cheeks would be flushed. His thin lips would be slightly parted, and he would be clutching the corner of the duvet tightly, like an insecure child. Julian gathered him into his arms, replacing the duvet corner with his own hand for Ethan to hold. Watching him sleep so peacefully, he couldn't resist leaning in and pressing a kiss to his lips. The next day, the news of Rex's cheating was announced campus-wide. But the punishment was much lighter than Ethan had expected. His grade for the course was simply voided. There was no mark on his permanent record, and he wasn't expelled. Perhaps this was the result of Julian's intervention. Otherwise, Ethan's anonymous tip would likely have vanished without a trace. He hadn't expected Julian to choose him over Rex. Ethan sat at his usual spot by the library window, his fingertips tapping on his textbook. For the first time, he couldn't focus on his studies, his mind frequently drifting. Choose him. It wasn't entirely surprising. Yesterday, when Julian said he would handle it, Ethan had assumed he would just have Rex apologize. He never thought Julian would not only validate his actions but also ensure his meticulously written, multi-hundred-word complaint didn't go to waste. Rex was actually punished. Perhaps because Ethan was visibly pleased. A girl who had been hesitating to sit next to him finally relaxed. She carefully took off her own backpack and sat down. Ethan subconsciously pushed his belongings closer to himself. The girl froze, thinking he didn't want anyone sitting next to him, and considered changing her seat. Ethan was oblivious to the turmoil in her mind. His attention was drawn to a commotion at the entrance of the second-floor reading room. Everyone's gaze was fixed on the updated electronic bulletin board. It announced, "The business school and law school jointly establish a specialized talent cultivation base for law and business management." The accompanying photo featured the university and department heads, and Julian Sterling. It had clearly been taken after Ethan had left. Ethan read the announcement, and out of curiosity, he opened his class group chat and scrolled through the messages to find the details. This program was more significant and practical than he had imagined. Not only would the two schools invite experts to teach case-based courses on law and business management, but outstanding students would also be eligible for fully funded study abroad opportunities. Fully funded study abroad? That piqued Ethan's interest. He checked his course schedule for the semester and found he had enough time. He messaged his class representative to sign up. The rep was surprised that Ethan wanted to join, asking incredulously if he was sure. He explained that the program would involve many group activities and frequent visits to companies, taking up a lot of free time. No matter how many times the rep asked for confirmation, Ethan's reply was a simple yes. After signing up, Ethan packed his books and went to the law school for his next class. A small decision, like a gentle breeze rustling the blossoms on a branch, fell lightly onto the surface of the water, creating a small ripple that quickly vanished. Ethan soon forgot about it. Until a month later, after finishing a listening comprehension exercise, he took off his headphones and saw that he had been added to a new group chat, Law and Business Management Young Innovators Cultivation Base. The group announcement read, "Students, the Civil Law and Business Case Studies class begins tonight at 6:30 p.m. in the Business School, Room 314. Lecturer, Professor Yang, former Associate Dean of the Law School." Ethan made a note of the time. At 6:20, he arrived at room 314. This was his second time in the business school, and he felt more familiar with the layout, finding his destination more quickly. But his luck was still bad. He once again pushed open the front door. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the atmosphere in the classroom freeze. The chatter died down instantly. Everyone stared at him wide-eyed, as if he had walked into the wrong room. But Ethan simply walked in, closed the door, and sat down in the front and center seat. Why is he here? Doesn't he hate group activities? Maybe it's for the CRS? If he cared about CRS, he'd show up for regular class activities. I heard he's planning to get into grad school on his GPA alone. This is so weird. Why did he have to join? I heard there are going to be random group projects. God, please don't put me in a group with him. A student from the business school who didn't know him leaned over and whispered to a law student, "Why do you all hate him? I think he's really good looking. I've never seen a beta who looks like that." The law student he asked crossed her arms and snorted. "Ha! If he looked at you once, you wouldn't think he was so good looking. I've never seen such creepy eyes." Ethan had long since learned to filter out such talk. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop. The room slowly filled up, but the professor had yet to arrive. Ethan organized the files on his desktop and was about to create a new document when the professor, dressed in a suit, walked in. He was engrossed in conversation with someone behind him, repeatedly turning his head as he walked. Everyone's eyes followed his gaze past the doorway, and they saw Julian Sterling. Julian was dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, a bag slung over one shoulder. He looked much more relaxed than usual, with a few strands of hair falling across his forehead. Professor Yang was animatedly saying something to him, still looking back as he neared the podium. Someone whispered that the professor used to be a legal consultant for Sterling Enterprises. At the mention of Sterling, Ethan raised his head, his gaze meeting Julian's. Ethan had never made eye contact with Julian in a public setting before. He was momentarily stunned. In his memory, he had rarely seen a fully dressed Julian. Most of the time, they were naked together. Even when Julian was clothed, it was in a robe or pajamas or a shirt that Ethan had ripped. None of it was presentable. He had almost forgotten what Julian was supposed to look like. The heir to Sterling Enterprises. A uniquely powerful alpha, handsome and envied by all. Every movement exuded an air of nobility. But in Ethan's eyes, he wasn't like that. Time seemed to stop for a few seconds. Ethan calmly retracted his gaze. Julian smiled and greeted Professor Yang, then walked into the classroom. By now, there were few seats left. So, like Ethan on that first day, he took the nearest empty seat in the front row, 2 seats away from Ethan. Another wave of gasps went through the room. Ethan found it slightly amusing. Julian didn't look at him, and he didn't look at Julian. They maintained a perfect 2-seat distance, both unfamiliar and not deliberately so. This time, no one would likely mock Ethan for using Julian to get attention. But no one would overinterpret Julian's action either. Because the names Ethan and Julian had no reason to be mentioned in the same breath. Professor Yang opened his prepared PowerPoint presentation and smiled at the class. After a brief self-introduction, he said, "Let's not waste time with pleasantries. We'll get right to it. The integration of law and business is a major trend. The fusion of these 2 fields is a concept full of philosophical thought. Can any of the law students tell me the basic characteristics of law? This should be very simple." No one had expected a professor to call on someone 3 sentences into the first class. Everyone looked at each other, playing dumb. Professor Yang scanned the room and was about to continue when Ethan raised his hand. "Yes, you can answer from your seat." Ethan raised his head slightly. He had the same detached, indifferent expression, but his answer was serious. Normativity, coerciveness, universality, and procedurality. Excellent. Your fundamentals are very solid. After answering, Ethan lowered his head, but in his peripheral vision, he saw Julian's lips curve into a smile. A strange annoyance pricked at him. Ethan's weirdness was also evident in his coldness toward people, but his active participation in class. Sitting in the front row was already strange enough, but he also raised his hand to answer every question, giving those who already disliked him more reason to criticize. Normally, he wouldn't care what others thought, but Julian's smile irritated him. Ethan shot him a sharp glance, but the smile on Julian's lips only deepened. Professor Yang continued, "Law has these characteristics of certainty. What kind of sparks will fly when it collides with the free and uncertain environment of business? That's what we'll be discussing next." Julian didn't seem to be paying close attention, looking down at his phone several times and replying to messages. Ethan realized his own attention had wandered. He shifted his body slightly to the side, trying to keep his gaze from straying. The first part of the class ended. Rex came up from the back row, picked up Julian's bag and said, "Bro, come sit in the back. Why associate with that bad juju?" Julian said it was fine. "I actually have something I need to talk to you about." Rex had found out that the anonymous tip had come from Ethan. He had wanted to tear it up and confront Ethan directly, but the university administration said Ethan's evidence was solid and his wording was harsh. If they swept it under the rug, it could cause even bigger problems. They couldn't dismiss it outright, only minimize the damage, giving him a failing grade for the course as punishment. Rex was baffled when he heard the result. He didn't know where things had gone wrong. How could someone report him for cheating and actually succeed? His feelings toward this persistent beta had morphed from mere dislike to outright hatred. Just as he was about to retaliate, Julian sent him to Shanghai to pick up a childhood friend. Rex's attention was diverted, and he decided to let it go. But seeing Ethan today, his anger flared up again. Seeing Ethan with his back to them, focused on organizing his notes, Rex was about to walk over and slam his laptop shut when Julian grabbed his arm. Julian's expression was serious, a hint of anger in his eyes. Rex froze. Julian was always gentle with people and rarely got angry. This was a clear not to push any further. Rex deflated instantly. He held Julian's bag and said, "Bro, let's go to the back. Caleb is here waiting for you." Julian glanced at Ethan, who was engrossed in typing, completely oblivious to them as if he were wearing earplugs. So he followed Rex to the back row. As soon as Julian left, the students behind Ethan started whispering. "Who's Caleb? Is that the Omega with the curly hair in the last row? Oh my God, he's so beautiful, like a doll. He and Julian are childhood sweethearts." Rex said so. He said Caleb has been studying abroad and came back specifically for Julian's grandfather's birthday. Childhood sweethearts with Julian? So his family must be wealthy too. They look so good together, though. Seriously, that guy's smile is so cute. This is like something out of a TV show. Ethan kept mistyping. He tried to type legal application 3 times, and it came out as legal appliance each time. He couldn't fix it. Maybe his eyes were tired from staring at the screen for too long. They felt itchy and blurry. He blinked a few times and flexed his fingers. On the 4th try, after seeing the correct word suggestion, he paused for 2 seconds before finally selecting it. He stared at his notes until the bell for the next class rang. Professor Yang walked back in and resumed his lecture. The 3-hour class ended close to 9 o'clock. It was completely dark outside. Ethan packed his backpack and left through the front door. He was still a bit lost but didn't want to follow the crowd. He slowed his pace, walking at the very end, looking around for another staircase. Finally, illuminated by the light from an adjacent study room, he saw a dark stairwell. He broke away from the group and headed toward it. Just as he reached the 2nd floor landing, a hand grabbed his wrist and pulled him into an empty classroom. Ethan smelled a familiar scent. Before he could speak, his lips were sealed. "You took the wrong turn again, classmate. This staircase leads to the B wing." Julian's voice was a low murmur against his ear. Ethan knew Julian was deliberately teasing him, so he remained expressionless, letting him do as he pleased. Ethan was always compliant in these situations. How long had it been since he'd last seen Julian? A month? No, that wasn't quite right. They had seen each other once, on his way back to campus after tutoring. On a narrow side street 1 block from the university, he had seen Julian's Range Rover. He was still debating whether to approach when Julian lowered the window and handed him a soda. "It's getting hot. You're dressed a bit warmly," he had said. Ethan took the drink, glanced at Julian, and walked away. It was strange. Their relationship was suited for physicality, for roughness, not for normal conversation. If Julian didn't pull him into the car, Ethan would refuse to say more than a single word to him. Julian seemed to understand this unspoken rule. He hadn't tried to stop Ethan that day, even as he walked further away. But now, in the pitch black, suffocatingly hot room, with the sound of students talking and their footsteps fading in the hallway outside, there was a thrilling, heart-pounding excitement. This was suited for them. So he parted his lips slightly, accepting Julian's intrusion. It was early May, the end of spring and the beginning of summer. The rising temperature dulled Ethan's sense of time. At first, he could hear the ticking of Julian's mechanical watch. He tried to use the rapid sound to replace his chaotic thoughts. But soon he couldn't hear anything. His hoodie was pushed up, and time stood still. In a daze, Ethan heard a single cicada chirp from the bushes below. Was it midsummer already? Summer had come early this year. He was used to the cold, but now all he felt was heat. Julian squeezed his warm fingertips. He had had the same thought and chuckled softly. Finally, your hands aren't freezing anymore. Julian had experienced the chill of Ethan's fingertips before. He had barely had a chance to enjoy it before he had grabbed his wrist and said, "Never mind." Ethan had withdrawn his hand, looking utterly innocent. Helpless, Julian had taken Ethan's hands in his own, rubbing them to warm them up. He had intended to continue once they were warm, but as he rubbed them, his gaze softened. He placed Ethan's now warm hands on his own waist and pulled the uncooperative beta into his arms, completely abandoning the idea of having Ethan service him. Later, Julian realized that Ethan's perpetually cold hands and feet were likely due to poor circulation. He had tried to get him some traditional Chinese medicine from an old doctor, but Ethan refused to drink it, not even for money. When that failed, he tried to get him to eat healthier, but Ethan resisted with a single sentence. "It'll be better in the summer." And indeed it was. Julian laced their fingers together. After a while of kissing, he suddenly asked, "Want to try again?" Ethan froze for a second, seemingly taking a few moments to remember what those words meant. Then he obediently hummed in agreement. The more compliant he was, the more unhappy Julian became. When Julian pressed him against the wall and bit the back of his neck, Ethan hadn't even processed what was happening before the vulnerable, scarred flesh was caught between his teeth. A sharp, indescribable pain. It wasn't excruciating, more a sense of bewilderment. He didn't understand why Julian always did this. This action was meaningless for them. Julian could go bite his childhood sweetheart Omega, who had a scent gland and a natural attraction. Though he had his complaints, Ethan still adhered to his professional ethics and didn't resist. No matter how much it hurt, no matter what Julian did to him, he wouldn't fight back. Julian's frustration came out of nowhere, and Ethan couldn't control it. For instance, he felt he was being cooperative enough, even resting his forehead on Julian's shoulder, but Julian still got angry. Julian bit down harder. "Wait a second." Julian ignored him. "Julian, stop." Ethan finally lost his temper. His brows were tightly furrowed, but Julian just laughed. He pulled him into a kiss, more tender and lingering than any before. Ethan really didn't understand him. Probably no one could. And no one would believe this was what Julian was like in private. By the time they finished, it was past 10. Ethan was lying on what felt like a desk or a cabinet, gasping for breath. Julian's jacket was spread out beneath him. While Julian rummaged through his bag for wet wipes, Ethan lay there. Julian didn't turn on the light because Ethan had said he had no interest in knowing where they were. As Julian helped him clean up, he asked, "Are you afraid you'll get flashbacks every time you have class here?" Ethan was startled. "This is actually a classroom?" "No, it's a rarely used club office." Ethan let out a barely audible sigh of relief. A motion-activated light in the hallway suddenly turned on, probably a security guard on patrol. A sliver of light seeped through the crack under the door. Ethan could vaguely make out their current state. He was sitting on a long table, his oversized hoodie askew, his pants half on, one leg exposed. His face and hair, he didn't even have to think about it, were a mess. But Julian, next to him, was neatly dressed, as if he had transformed back into the well-respected young master from the classroom. As if Ethan was the only one who had participated in their tryst. Ethan quickly got dressed. Julian went to open the window, but Ethan said not to bother. They both fell into a silence. Ethan could feel Julian trying to say something several times, but he hesitated. The only sound in Ethan's ears was the incessant chirping of cicadas, until a ringing broke the quiet. Julian's phone was ringing. It was Caleb. Ethan heard a bright, slightly sweet voice on the other end. "Julian, where are you? I thought you were talking with Professor Young. Rex and I have been waiting in the parking lot forever, only to find out the professor left a long time ago. Where did you go? Something came up. You guys go ahead. I'll be there around 11. What is it? You still have to work this late?" Ethan's hair was damp with sweat, sticking to the back of his neck. Julian used his free left hand to brush a strand of hair from Ethan's ear and said, "Company business." "All right," Caleb mumbled. "You work so hard. I'll wait for you at Elysium. Rex has already set up the party." In class, Ethan had never turned around to look, nor had he cared what this beautiful Omega, who everyone said was a perfect match for Julian, looked like. But now, just from his voice, Ethan could picture Caleb's appearance. He added a soft-sounding word to the end of every sentence, but because his voice was naturally sweet, it didn't sound cloying. If Ethan weren't currently having a clandestine affair with Julian in a dark, disused office in a university building, he might have smiled at such a cute voice. But right now, all he felt was hot. This abandoned office was too stuffy. There was only one small, tightly shut window. The motion-activated light in the hallway had gone out again, plunging them back into darkness. After hanging up, Julian helped Ethan down and picked up his own jacket, shaking it out. His voice held a hint of amusement. "I thought you would ask." Ethan picked up his canvas backpack from the floor. "Ask what?" Julian was silent for a moment, then smiled. "Yeah, what is there to ask?" He felt the fabric of Ethan's hoodie and reminded him again, "It's getting warmer. You're dressed a bit too warmly." "I don't mind the heat." Ethan took a step back. Before opening the door, Julian handed his phone to Ethan. This time, Ethan didn't take it immediately. He didn't smoothly transfer the money to himself. Instead, he hesitated for a few seconds, his brow slightly furrowed, before reaching for it. Julian's lock screen password was 031521. Ethan had once tried to guess the meaning of this number, but to no avail. It wasn't the date they first met or their first time or any other significant date. They had first met on April 3, 2021, 3 days before Julian's birthday. It was still chilly in April, and he remembered feeling cold in an unlined hoodie not long ago. How had it become summer so quickly? Ethan's thoughts had drifted far away. Julian watched him quietly using the light from the phone screen. Ethan was a mess from their encounter. His hair was disheveled, his cheeks were flushed, and his lips were slightly swollen. Julian liked seeing him like this, marked by him. After half a minute, Ethan came back to his senses and opened Venmo. He entered 2,000 on the transfer screen. The payment password was the same as the lock screen password. Ethan didn't understand why Julian would so readily give his password to a hookup. He had asked him once, "Aren't you afraid I'll clear out your bank account while you're asleep?" Julian, who had been brewing him some medicinal tea at the time, had looked up and smiled. "You don't have to wait until I'm asleep." He hadn't expected that answer. Ethan's smile faded, and he didn't pursue the topic. Strange. Ethan's thoughts drifted again. He forced himself to focus, entered the last digit of the password, and the transfer was successful. A transaction completed. After the transfer, Ethan's scattered thoughts finally settled. Julian opened the door first, looked outside, then turned to Ethan and said, "You can go first." Ethan didn't hesitate. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and was about to leave when Julian pulled him back. Julian slammed the door shut, pressing Ethan against it, their foreheads touching. Julian's breathing filled Ethan's ears. He first bit the tip of Ethan's nose. Just as their lips were about to touch, he suddenly stopped, their lips just brushing, deliberately not a real kiss. "You're really not gonna ask anything?" Ethan had thought Julian could hold it in. "If you ask, I'll tell you." It was practically coaxing. Ethan's reply was the same. "Ask what?" A few seconds of silence passed. Julian released him, neither disappointed nor angry. His expression was as natural as when he had reminded him to change into lighter clothes. He opened the door again. "You go first. The stairs are on your left, the one with the trash can. Don't get lost." As Ethan walked out, Julian added, his voice full of concern, "Turn on your phone's flashlight. Be careful on the stairs." Ethan thought to himself, "If you speak any louder, everyone in the 24-hour study room will hear you." Julian was so annoying. Sometimes he was a nag. Sometimes he was just baffling. Ethan quickened his pace, but his legs were sore and weak. He could only turn back and glare at him. "Shut up." Julian smiled at him, leaning against the doorframe, watching as Ethan slowly disappeared from sight. When Julian arrived at Elysium, a club owned by Caleb's father, Caleb immediately greeted him. "We've been waiting for you forever." "You didn't have to wait for me." Julian handed his car keys to the valet. Caleb's eyes sparkled as he walked up to Julian and smiled. "If you're not here, who would dare to start?" Julian walked with him to the party entrance. Rex was slumped on a long sofa, wreathed in smoke, a dark cloud hanging over him. He only stubbed out his cigarette and sat up when he saw Julian. "What's wrong with him?" Julian asked. Caleb shrugged. "I don't know. He's been like that since class ended. Something about seeing a jinx in the front row. I don't know what he's talking about." Julian's expression remained unchanged. Rex stood up, running a hand through his messy hair. The gloom on his face hadn't lifted. He pulled out a chair for Julian. "Bro, I brought 2 bartenders. We were just waiting for you." He was only a month younger than Julian, but he had willingly called him bro for 20 years. Their glasses clinked together. "You're in a bad mood?" Julian asked, his tone calm, both a question and a. Rex knew Julian disliked it when his friends acted like campus bullies. He mumbled, "No." "Really? Really?" Rex scratched the back of his neck. "Just failed a class. It's a hassle. I have to retake it. I told you, you worked hard to get in here. You should put in some effort." Rex's father had originally planned to send him abroad, but Rex had insisted on going to Northwood University with Julian. With his grades, he wouldn't have made the cut even if they were doubled. His father had hired private tutors for him and pulled strings to get him in as a student athlete. He had barely scraped by to get into Northwood, but he didn't cherish the opportunity. Rex sighed. "Even my dad has given up on me." Caleb interrupted them. "Hey, let's not talk about that. Let's have a drink first. It's been a while since we were all together." With Caleb's return, several of their childhood friends had gathered. They laughed as they reminisced about their childhood. Julian listened quietly, smiling but not speaking, occasionally glancing at his phone. Caleb leaned in, looking up at Julian's face. "Julian, you seem different since I came back." "Hmm?" Julian put down his phone. "You're a little different from before." Julian chuckled. "Is that so?" Caleb noticed the new inhibitor patch on the back of Julian's neck, but he said nothing. He couldn't smell any pheromones on Julian, which meant there was no omega close to him. Even if there was, it would be a low-level one. Caleb had secretly checked his compatibility with Julian. It was 71%, not a bad result. Even if Julian wasn't interested in him, he didn't think Julian would ever be with a low-level Omega. As for a beta, that was even more impossible. Caleb wanted to ask more, but Julian had already lowered his gaze, the smile on his lips fading slightly. Caleb didn't dare to speak. Julian had an enigmatic aura. He was gentle and kind, never bullying the weak. Compared to the other alphas in his circle who rode on his coattails, Julian was a true gentleman. Caleb had never seen him angry. Julian's father, Harrison Sterling, was known for his ruthless business tactics, often called a wolf of real estate in his early years. Harrison had Julian late in life and doted on his exceptionally talented alpha son. It was said that at his first birthday ceremony, Julian had grabbed a golden abacus, and everyone had laughed, saying he would follow in his father's footsteps, a little wolf in the making. But Julian had grown up to be gentle and refined. This personality made him well-liked from a young age. He was praised wherever he went, and he received enough love letters to fill half a room. But those who knew him well would discover that he wasn't as warm and approachable as he seemed, especially in conversation. If Julian didn't actively engage, the other person would instinctively hold back. Just like Caleb now. He moved his lips but ultimately said nothing. Caleb had been abroad since early last year and hadn't returned for a whole year due to some personal matters. He had missed Julian terribly and had planned to stick close to him during his visit for Julian's grandfather's birthday. But he soon realized something was wrong. Julian really was different. He couldn't pinpoint what had changed, but the way he kept looking down at his phone screen was unsettling. It was hard to believe that Julian Sterling could be troubled by worldly affairs. Caleb found it incredible. After a few drinks, Caleb pulled Rex aside and whispered, "Is Julian seeing someone?" Rex waved his hand dismissively. "No way. Really? Yeah, I'm with him all the time. How would I not know if he was dating someone?" Rex looked up, thinking, "I can't even imagine Julian in a relationship. It feels like what?" Rex thought for a long time, then slapped the table. "Feels like he's broken some kind of vow." Caleb laughed. "I feel that way too." The combination of his sophomore year courses and the cultivation-based program made Ethan's life much busier. He turned down a new tutoring student recommended by one of his current clients. The two children he was tutoring now had weak fundamentals, and with the SATs just 2 months away, he was stretched thin. Every June, Ethan had a guaranteed money-making project, SAT consulting for high school students at $800 per session. He would concentrate the sessions into 1 week. During that week, anyone who called him would get a busy signal. Fortunately, besides Julian, no one else ever called him. In short, Ethan always kept his schedule packed. Classes, tutoring, program courses. The only headache was Julian, because Julian's calls were never scheduled. Ethan had once tried to suggest a regular schedule, but Julian had raised an eyebrow and asked, "I'm paying, and I have to follow your timetable?" Ethan wanted to argue but held back. It was ridiculous to talk about dignity in this situation. So he gave up and settled for a compromise. "If there's a scheduling conflict, we'll go with your schedule," Julian had said, ending the discussion. Ethan was satisfied with the outcome. After that, it was just turning off the lights, drawing the curtains, and a night of pleasure. It seemed they could never have a proper conversation. Their topics began and ended with sex. They couldn't find anything else to talk about. After they finished that day, Ethan turned over to sleep. Julian got a hot towel to clean him up. Ethan always shamelessly enjoyed Julian's postcoital service. Because Julian's needs far exceeded the limits of a normal transaction, He felt it was a bad deal for him. He lay there, his legs still trembling. His chest felt raw, and he thought he would need a bandage tomorrow, or even wearing a shirt would hurt. Even more troublesome were the marks on his neck. It wasn't winter anymore, when a turtleneck could hide everything. With midsummer approaching, many students on campus were already in short sleeves. Ethan worried. When Julian got close, he couldn't help but push him away. Julian asked what was wrong, but he was too lazy to explain. Ethan cooperatively lifted his legs, extended his arms, and turned over. He thought to himself, thankfully, his hair was shoulder length. If he didn't tie it back, it would cover his neck completely. As he was thinking, Julian suddenly hugged him from behind, burying his face in his hair. He reported, as if checking in, "I went to Shanghai this morning. The round trip took over 3 hours. The traffic was bad on the way back. I thought I wouldn't make it today." Ethan was stunned for a moment, then replied with a simple "oh." Julian chuckled and continued, "I'm a bit tired." Ethan thought to himself, "I don't see you being tired at all." But he only said, "oh." Julian held his hand. They lay together for a while, and then the doorbell rang. Ethan froze for 2 seconds, then shot up. Julian, still half asleep, put a hand on his waist, trying to pull him back, but the doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. Then Julian's phone rang. It was Caleb. "Julian, are you home? I came to celebrate your belated birthday. I made a cake myself." Julian and Ethan looked at each other. Caleb's voice was filled with confusion. "I see the lights on in your living room. Are you not home?" Ethan pushed Julian away forcefully. Julian looked at him, his brow furrowing slightly. He picked up his phone and said, "I'm home." Ethan shuddered. Julian seemed to be enjoying his predicament, his expression smoothing out, his voice cool as he said to Caleb, "Just a moment." He picked up his scattered clothes from the floor, put on a new inhibitor patch, and walked out of the bedroom toward the door. He didn't seem to care how Ethan would handle the situation. In his peripheral vision, he saw Ethan sitting on the bed in a daze, his face pale, his eyes filled with panic. He was curious to see what Ethan would do. Surprise. Caleb held the cake box in front of his face, then lowered it with a bright smile. "A belated birthday wish. Happy birthday, Julian." "Thanks." Julian took the cake. Before Caleb could speak, he said, "Caleb, something's come up. I can't entertain you right now." Caleb's smiling eyes froze when he saw the love bite on Julian's neck. The Spanish-style wall clock with its rock-textured face ticked almost silently. The sound intertwined with Julian's footsteps. The distance from the front door to the bedroom was not long. After a perfunctory exchange with Caleb, Julian realized he had been multitasking. The ticking of the clock was calm and slow, but his steps toward the bedroom grew faster. The bedroom was empty. The bed was neatly made, the duvet folded. The clothes and condom wrappers on the floor had been picked up. The curtains were open, and the window was slightly ajar, letting in fresh air. It was as if nothing had happened, as if Ethan had never been there. Julian's first thought was that Ethan had escaped. But the bedroom window was a narrow casement window. An adult male, especially someone as tall as Ethan at 5'10", couldn't possibly climb out. So escape was unlikely. He hadn't seen Ethan when he was talking to Caleb at the door, so he must still be in the bedroom. Julian's gaze shifted to the wardrobe. The large, coffee-colored wardrobe stood at the foot of the bed. Julian took a step forward, his fingertips resting on the handle. He held his breath. He pulled the door open. He wasn't met with the panicked eyes he expected. Ethan was indeed curled up in the wardrobe, but he was looking down, hugging his knees, completely frozen. He was wearing his own long-sleeved cotton shirt, revealing a slender neck covered in love bites. Ethan wasn't small. He was taller than most betas. His features, especially the lower half of his face, had a distant coldness. But at this moment, he looked so fragile and pitiful. "He's gone," Julian said. Ethan didn't move. Julian bent down to pick him up. The moment he touched Ethan's waist, Ethan swatted his hand away with surprising force. He pushed Julian with all his might. Julian stumbled back a few steps. As Ethan tried to flee, Julian grabbed him again, throwing him onto the bed. They struggled, almost fighting. Ethan panted, and Julian gripped his chin, forcing him to make eye contact. "What are you hiding from? Why are you angry with me?" Ethan didn't speak. Julian's grip tightened until the veins on the back of his hand stood out. "Ethan, say something." Silence couldn't solve everything. "There's nothing to solve." Julian was stunned. "What?" "There's nothing between us that needs to be solved. It was a financial transaction from the beginning. We can end it whenever you want." Talking about feelings in this kind of relationship was something Ethan couldn't comprehend. What was even more incomprehensible to Ethan was that Julian started giving him the silent treatment because of it. For 2 whole months. That day, he had been pinned to the bed, unable to struggle free. Julian had gripped his shoulders so tightly that Ethan felt his shoulder blades would shatter. Julian's gaze had been so fierce that for a moment, Ethan thought he would be torn apart by the enraged alpha. But in the end, Julian had let him go. Ethan was grateful he was a beta. If he were an omega, he would have been overwhelmed by the alpha's pheromones, paralyzed and in agony. Fortunately, he was a beta. No matter how dangerously potent the pheromones were, he was unaffected. Julian could only use his physical strength to overpower him, but he couldn't make him submit. After a half-minute standoff, Julian's gaze suddenly softened. He smiled self-deprecatingly and released his grip. As he let him go, Julian didn't forget to transfer the money. $2,000 arrived in his account. Julian added, "Let's not see each other for the next 2 months." Ethan's first thought was, "Weren't you the one who always initiated our meetings?" His second thought was, "How can we not see each other? You still have the case studies class for the program." But for the next 2 months, Julian never once appeared in room 314 of the business school. Ethan enjoyed the peace. He extended his SAT consulting service to 2 weeks, earning nearly $20,000. He deposited all the money into his bank account and sat on a bench outside the library, staring at the balance. The sun beat down, making the air hot and stifling. It felt like it was about to rain. The air was heavy and still. The campus cats were too hot to move, lounging in the shade, stretching. The security guards had stopped their patrols. The tree-lined avenue was deserted. But Ethan just stared at his phone screen, his gaze fixed, until it went dark. A few minutes later, he received a message from his mother. "I was diagnosed with stomach polyps a while ago. I'm having a minor surgery to remove them tomorrow." Ethan sent her $50,000. A moment later, the money was returned. "What do I need your money for?" "I'm just letting you know. You should also pay attention to your diet and get enough rest. I heard stomach polyps can be hereditary. Don't work too hard." Ethan replied, "Okay." He continued to sit in the sun. A while later, he transferred the money to her again, without a word. Finals were approaching. The dreaded exam week was upon the university, and Ethan couldn't afford to be careless. He negotiated with the parents of his tutees, concentrating his tutoring sessions on weekend evenings. The boy was naturally playful, and on weekend nights, his attention was even more scattered. He fidgeted with a toy, slumping over the desk or sprawling on his chair as if he had no bones. He just didn't want to do his work. He kept glancing at Ethan, expecting a scolding. But when he looked closely, he realized that his tutor's attention wasn't on his workbook either. Mr. Evans was zoning out. This was a major discovery. He leaned in close to Ethan and whispered, "Mr. Evans, Mr. Evans." Ethan finally snapped out of it, a little embarrassed. "Are you done with the problems?" The boy mumbled, "No." Usually, Ethan would get angry at this point. His features weren't gentle, and when he wasn't smiling, he looked fierce, which was very effective for intimidating children. A slight frown was enough to make the boy swallow nervously. But this time, it was as if Ethan hadn't heard him. He held the red pen and the workbook and said to himself, "You're done? Let me see." The boy quickly snatched it back. "No, I'm not done." He clutched the workbook to his chest. "I said I'm not done. Mr. Evans, what's wrong with you today?" Ethan was stunned. After a moment, his expression returned to normal. "I was thinking about my own exams. And you," he said, "you have exams coming up too. But you've only done 5 calculation problems in half an hour?" The boy immediately shrank back in his seat, saying in a mix of anger and fear, I know. You're so mean." After a while, the boy's attention wandered again. He whispered, "But Mr. Evans, you were really spacing out just now." Ethan looked at him. "Yes. So?" The boy pouted, unable to come up with a reply. He just lowered his head and went back to his work. After the session, the boy's mother, Mrs. Chun, pulled Ethan aside to ask about his progress. His grades had improved so much before, but in the last few weekly tests, he's been having problems again. His teacher said he got some of the easiest questions wrong. Mrs. Chin suddenly stopped. "Mr. Evans? Mr. Evans? What's wrong today?" Ethan emerged from his thoughts and smiled apologetically. He tried to recall what she had just said. Maybe because his grades improved, he got a little complacent, and his attitude towards studying has slipped. I don't think you should keep telling him how much his grades have improved or focus on his rankings. Just treat his academic ups and downs with a level head. Mrs. Chen's expression changed slightly, then she nodded and smiled. "Ethan, you're a very mature young man. I wish I knew how your mother raised you. I could really use some advice from her." Ethan froze. He thought for a long time, then looked down at the boy's mistakes and said casually, "She just let me be." Mrs. Chun looked at her son, who was sprawled in front of the TV, and sighed helplessly. "I guess I need to learn to let go too. Otherwise, I'll get sick from anger before he even grows up." Ethan didn't reply. He stood up and said, "Mrs. Chin, I should be going." "Okay. Be safe on your way home." When he got back to the dorm, Jake had just come back from the laundry room. He shoved Ethan's dry clothes to one side to make space for his own. He noticed Ethan had come in and, feeling a little guilty, he reached out as if to pull a couple of Ethan's shirts back. But Ethan walked past him without a glance, took his dry clothes, and carried them back to his room. It was as if he hadn't seen what Jake had done. He folded them one by one and put them in his closet. Leo and Jake exchanged a look of exasperation. They felt it wasn't their fault. It had been 2 years. Anyone would go crazy living with a silent, unsociable, and isolated ghost who never interacted with anyone. If Ethan were uglier or meaner or just more invisible, they wouldn't be so bothered. But Ethan had beautiful features and a tall, slender frame. If not for his long hair and overly casual clothes, no one would believe he was just a beta. His personality was cold, but he never got into direct conflicts. He got A's in every major course. His GPA was at the top of his class. He was so annoying, yet why did he always make people want to ask him, "Ethan, why don't you talk to people?" Leo's relationship with Ethan wasn't as bad as Jake's, so he was the one who spoke up. "Ethan, do you have a problem with us?" Ethan looked around his closet, seeming genuinely confused by the question. "If you have something to say, just say it. Can you?" Julian's voice suddenly echoed in his ears. "Ethan, say something. Silence can't solve everything." But what was the problem? What were they trying to say? Ethan turned to look at Leo. "I don't have a problem with you. If you have something to say, just say it. If you have a problem, just tell us. You don't have to be like this." Ethan's expression became even more bewildered. "I don't." Leo felt like he was suffocating. Jake cut him off impatiently. "All right, stop trying. It's pointless." It was indeed pointless. Leo chugged half a can of Coke, put on his headphones, and went back to his game. "Just pretend I didn't ask." Ethan sat at his desk in silence for a moment. Then he took his clothes and went to the bathroom, turning on the hot water. He took out the small elastic band from his hair. Julian hadn't contacted him recently, so his neck was safe. And with the weather getting hotter, he had started tying his long hair back again. The wound on the back of his neck from Julian's bite had long since healed, leaving no trace. A while ago, Ethan had fallen and scraped his arm and wrist. He hadn't paid much attention to it, but it had been almost a month, and the scab still hadn't completely disappeared. In comparison, Julian's bites hadn't been that severe. It was just that an alpha's canines were so sharp that they always made him flinch. The feeling of being helpless in bed was terrifying, but the actual pain wasn't that intense. With him, Julian was always all bark and no bite. Julian. He hadn't thought of his name in days. Ethan felt a little dazed. As if he couldn't remember his name, he mouthed it twice. "Julian, Julian." His parents must have hoped he would grow up safe and sound. The next day, in the case studies class, Ethan took his usual seat in the front row. He had just opened his laptop to find last week's notes when Julian walked in, with Rex trailing behind him. Ethan's attention was on his screen. He only caught a glimpse of a familiar figure in his peripheral vision, but he kept his eyes on the screen until Julian sat down in the front row. Just like the first class, it was just the two of them in the front row with two empty seats between them. Ethan instinctively turned to look at him. The professor hadn't arrived yet. After 2 months, the law and business students had gotten to know each other, so the atmosphere was much more relaxed than the first class and much louder. Everyone noticed Julian, who hadn't been to class in a long time. Even in a simple t-shirt and jeans, he seemed to light up the drab classroom. Many people didn't dare to look at him directly, instead searching for Rex to find out what Julian had been doing for the past 2 months. Everyone was so curious that they forgot to wonder why Julian was sitting in the front row again. It was a girl in the row behind Ethan who mumbled, "There are plenty of empty seats in the second and third rows." Ethan thought so too, but Julian was looking at him, his expression somewhat weary. Ethan turned his head away, not meeting Julian's unspoken gaze. Today's lecturer was not Professor Young. It was a different professor, discussing the integration of law and business and its impact on banking and insurance. The material was highly technical, and the professor started with a string of professional jargon. Many of the freshmen and sophomores couldn't follow, but Ethan, with his keen interest in money, took copious notes. The main risk in family-owned businesses where personal and corporate assets are not separated is the commingling of funds between the company and its shareholders. From the perspective of banks and insurance companies, these high-net-worth clients have a need for generational wealth transfer, which has given rise to a popular term in recent years, the family trust. Ethan heard someone behind him whisper, "I heard Julian's father set up a family trust in his name years ago." Ethan's concentration was broken again. He kept hitting the wrong keys. The frequent use of the backspace key made him seem more agitated than usual. Julian's attention was drawn to him. Ethan glanced at him and saw that Julian was wearing a watch. He rarely wore one in front of Ethan, and even when he did, he would take it off when they met. This one had a black strap and a deep blue face. Ethan had never seen him wear this style before. He suddenly remembered what he had overheard in the wardrobe 2 months ago. The connection was random but plausible. Julian also noticed Ethan's pause and looked at his own watch in confusion. When he looked up again, Ethan had already nonchalantly turned away. From Julian's perspective, he could see Ethan's long fingers flying across the keyboard. But for some reason, Ethan's typing suddenly slowed down. Julian watched him intently, a feeling growing that Ethan's gaze was intermittently landing on him. He looked down at himself again but saw nothing unusual. Was it the watch? It was a birthday present from his mother. Was Ethan curious about his watch? Curious about who gave it to him? Impossible. Ethan would never care about such things. Julian immediately dismissed the thought. Then what was Ethan looking at? Just as Julian was about to continue his observation, his phone vibrated. He picked it up. It was a new message. "Stray kitten, turn your head. Stop staring at me. So fierce." Julian's lips curved into a smile. He obediently turned his head toward the professor, feigning rapt attention. In this class, we've discussed the first business risk, asset commingling. Law students should pay particular attention to the different types of asset commingling, as this is a key topic in business law. Next class, we will discuss the second key point, joint guarantees. Alright, let's take a break. The bell rang just then. The professor walked down from the podium and greeted Julian. "Julian, I heard from your uncle that you've started to get involved in Sterling's business." "Professor Kane, long time no see." Julian nodded politely and smiled. "Not really involved, just following my father around. I saw news about Sterling Enterprises a few days ago. I used to think you took after your mother, but when I saw that photo, you look exactly like your father when he was young." "Yes, people often say that." Professor Kane took a sip of his tea. "You'll probably have a more intuitive understanding of the case studies we discuss in class than the other students." Julian smiled. "With so many talented students here, maybe some of them will be interested in becoming legal consultants for Sterling. They could be your right-hand men." Professor Kane suddenly took a step toward Ethan. "This student here, he must be from the law school. He's very active in class discussions, has strong analytical skills, and a solid foundation. Very impressive." Ethan was praised out of the blue and was a bit bewildered. Professor Kane didn't notice the deliberately distant field between Ethan and Julian. He kept trying to make conversation, asking Julian, "Are you and this student acquainted?" Julian raised an eyebrow, seemed to study Ethan's profile for a moment, and then said, "Not really." "Well, you could get to know each other." Professor Kane looked down at Ethan's laptop screen. "Look at his notes." "Oh?" Ethan sensed something was wrong, but Julian had already moved to sit next to him. The familiar scent of his cologne washed over him, and his whole body tensed. Ethan had once been curious about the scent of Julian's pheromones, but he would never ask, and he had no one to ask. So one night, while Julian was asleep, he had leaned in close to his neck and sniffed. He hadn't smelled anything, but he had woken Julian up. Julian had propped himself up on one elbow and looked at him with an amused expression. Ethan hated that look. He had turned his back to him. A moment later, Julian had gotten out of bed, gone to the bathroom, and returned with a bottle of cologne. He had sprayed a little on Ethan's wrist. It was that scent. Ethan couldn't describe it. It was like a light sandalwood, but with a medicinal, cool note. He had mumbled, "I don't like it." Julian had feigned anger and bitten his shoulder. Ethan suspected that wasn't Julian's actual pheromone scent. After all, he didn't think anyone, especially a high-level alpha like Julian with so many people after him, would go around wearing a cologne that smelled like their pheromones. It was better to keep his true scent a secret. He thought Julian was lying to him. But after that day, Ethan noticed that Julian never seemed to use that light blue bottle of cologne again. The sandalwood scent never reappeared on him. It was replaced by another scent. A unique, faint, slightly soapy scent that was distinctly Julian's. It didn't seem like a commercial cologne. Ethan didn't use any, so he couldn't tell. He even thought it might just be the scent of his laundry detergent. Perhaps because they couldn't sense pheromones, betas had a more sensitive sense of smell. Ethan would often smell Julian's scent before he even noticed him approaching. It was the same this time. First, his senses were filled with Julian's scent. Then he felt an invisible pressure. Julian had sat down next to him. Just like that, in the noisy classroom, amid the gasps of the girls in the second row. As more and more students noticed what Julian had done and the room suddenly fell quiet, Julian had leaned in so brazenly, so close that his breath could stir the strands of hair that fell over Ethan's shoulder. The probing glances from all around felt like tiny arrows, piercing the space between their increasingly close shoulders. Ethan was annoyed. He scooted over. "Let me see." Julian deliberately leaned closer to Ethan, his voice drawn out. "The marital risk section, why didn't you take notes on that, Ethan?" Ethan said in a very low voice, "Get away from me." Julian's tone was even stranger, as if he were speaking to Professor Kane, but also to Ethan. "It seems our classmate isn't interested in the topic of marital property." Ethan didn't want to talk to him at all and frowned. Julian whispered in a voice only they could hear, "It's been 2 months. Don't you have anything else to say to me?" "No. Get away from me, Ethan. I don't want to be the center of attention because of you." Julian seemed to have anticipated this reaction and chuckled softly. He then leaned back naturally against his chair and continued talking to Professor Kane. Ethan took his mug to get some hot water. "Do you have plans for grad school, Julian?" Professor Kane asked. "I think so. Although my father wants me to get familiar with the company's operations so he can retire early, I think I still have the energy to get a master's. If I manage my time well, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Your father is so lucky to have a son like you." Julian smiled, his fingertips tracing the steel case of his watch. His gaze fell on Ethan's gray canvas backpack. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Rex. "Bro, come sit in the back. I saved you a seat." Julian replied, "It's fine. No need. I wouldn't have signed up for this class with you if I knew it was so boring. If you want to leave, just let the class rep know." "No way. I heard there's a field trip next semester. I'm waiting for that." Julian smiled and continued his conversation with Professor Kane. "Professor Kane, are you still at Apex Insurance?" "No, I left 2 years ago. I'm a partner at a law firm in Shanghai now. I have a few IPO projects on my hands, so I'm swamped." Julian smiled. "You have a very impressive resume." He suddenly tapped Ethan's laptop. "When this classmate of mine graduates and looks for a job, I'll have to ask for your help, Professor Kane." Professor Kane had thought they were complete strangers. He was caught off guard by Julian's sudden comment and quickly said, "Haha, of course. It's nothing. But with your classmate's work ethic, he'd be overqualified for my firm." Ethan returned with his hot water. Julian was still sitting comfortably next to him. Professor Kane was on the phone in the hallway. Without him there, Julian had no reason to stay. Ethan heard whispers and couldn't tell how many people were talking about him and Julian. Ethan was used to being invisible. He had always tried his best to minimize his presence, only occasionally being active in class for the sake of his GPA. At all other times, he remained quiet and distant. Although the invisibility he strove for was seen as gloominess by others, he was very happy with his current state. His arrangement with Julian was a bit out of character, but Ethan didn't think it was a big deal. They could just get what they needed from each other in private, where no one could see. They had been doing it for a year. He didn't understand why Julian had been pushing the boundaries lately, catching him off guard again and again. He sat down. "What happened to your hand?" Julian asked. Ethan saw the long scrape on the back of his hand and nonchalantly pulled down his sleeve to cover it. "Nothing. Where did you fall?" "The track." Julian frowned slightly, but Ethan clearly didn't want to continue the conversation, so he didn't press. When Ethan used his laptop, he habitually rested his arm on the armrest. As he did so, he bumped into Julian. Julian was sitting with his arm extended over the armrest, pressing against Ethan's, unmoving. Julian was tall, and the classroom chairs were obviously a bit cramped for him. So even though he was deliberately provoking Ethan, it didn't look strange to others. Ethan. Childish. Julian was wearing a short-sleeved shirt, and Ethan was in a long-sleeved one. A layer of cotton separated them, but it couldn't block their body heat. It easily brought back memories of more intimate moments. "Do you really have nothing to say to me?" "No." "Do you miss me?" Ethan sat up straight. He knew Julian's voice was low, and the people behind them couldn't hear, but he was still startled. He answered irritably, "No." The reply was sharp. Julian's eyebrow twitched, and he smiled self-deprecatingly before getting up and returning to his own seat. Ethan finally breathed a sigh of relief. The bell rang, and Professor Kane returned to the podium. The students who had been outside gradually came back in. Julian sat casually by the aisle, occasionally looking at his phone, texting someone. Ethan didn't understand why Julian had joined the program. As Professor Kane had said, Julian could find answers to everything they discussed in class within his own family's business. Ethan once again found Julian to be a very strange person. After class, Ethan slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked out of the business school. The business school was far from his dorm, and there was a small grove of trees in between, mostly elms and camphor trees. In the early morning mist, it was as beautiful as a scenic spot. But it was late and dark now, and there was a shorter, more direct route, so most students avoided this path. Ethan soon separated from the crowd and walked silently into the woods. It seemed he was heading back to his dorm, but also as if he were looking for something. After a few steps, Julian grabbed his arm and pulled him into his arms. Ethan was tall, but he was still no match for Julian. When Julian hugged him, his cheek always bumped against Julian's shoulder, and it hurt. The midsummer night's breeze blew through the elm grove, dissipating the heat, leaving only silence. Julian bit Ethan's lip, applying a little pressure, then released him before he could struggle. He rested his forehead against Ethan's and said helplessly, "You really have no heart, Ethan. I see you clearly now." Ethan felt he should say something in his defense, but Julian's hand was already under his shirt. As his clothes were being removed, Ethan belatedly realized that this meant they were back together. Why had they been giving each other the silent treatment? He couldn't remember. The woods weren't secluded enough. At Ethan's insistence, Julian took him to the parking garage. In the car again, his body was tossed and turned, making it difficult to even think. Took him a while to adjust, and then his thoughts slowly cleared. Why the silent treatment? It seemed it was because he had said, It was a financial transaction from the beginning. We can end it whenever you want. The moment he said that, Julian's eyes had turned cold. But even now, with Julian on top of him, doing as he pleased, Ethan still felt he hadn't said anything wrong. What was wrong with that? That's what they had agreed on from the beginning. The air in the car was thick and heavy, a mix of nameless heat and dizziness. The tinted windows blocked out the moon, and no one outside could see the passionate scene within. Ethan tried to open the window several times, his pale wrist trembling as he reached for the button on the door, only to be pulled back by Julian. And Alpha's pheromones couldn't be released outside. They could only be unleashed on the oblivious beta. After an unknown amount of time, Ethan propped himself up on Julian's chest, his neck covered in sweat, his eyelashes damp. He caught his breath and tried to stop him. "Julian, what's with you today?" Julian didn't let up. "You owe me for one rut." Who ever heard of an alpha like Julian, needing a rut every 2 months, each time like an earthquake? "I don't owe you that. I have no obligation." Julian suddenly buried his face in Ethan's chest. "You ignored me for 2 whole months." Ethan was speechless. "For 2 whole months, if I don't contact you, you never contact me. You don't even care why I stopped coming to class. We've known each other for over a year, and I still had a little hope for you." Julian kept rambling. Ethan just wanted him to finish quickly. "Who talks so much during sex? Did you really not miss me at all?" Julian pressed. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He cut him off, his voice cold. "Shut up and hurry up." That seemed to have the opposite effect. Ethan never dared to say hurry up again. When it was over, Ethan stared at the car ceiling. In the dim light, the sapphire blue face of Julian's mechanical watch on his wrist reflected a cool glow. Ethan's gaze shifted to the window. The moon was bright. Ethan often felt a sense of disconnect. Was this shameless Julian in front of him the same as the sophisticated and arrogant Julian from the classroom? He even wondered if the Julian of today was the same person as the Julian from over a year ago. Over a year ago, on a day in early March, the weather hadn't warmed up yet. The cold wind blew the dead leaves from the branches, creating a desolate scene. Ethan was coming from a student's house. The wind whipped into his collar. He took a scarf out of his bag and wrapped it around his neck. This was his last tutoring session for the week. He was tired, but he wanted to replace his old second-hand laptop with a new one, which would cost over $5,000. So after the tutoring session, he had casually asked the parents if they knew of any other students who needed tutoring. The parent thought for a moment, then slapped her thigh. "There is one. He's in 8th grade. His family is super rich. They've gone through several tutors, but none of them worked out. Want to give it a try?" An 8th grader at a private high school, last name Sterling. His father was a vice president at Sterling Enterprises. This was all Ethan knew before he met Leo Sterling. After contacting Leo's parents, and with the help of the previous parent, he smoothly passed the interview with Leo's mother. The weather was particularly cold that day. Ethan followed the map on his phone and spent over 2 hours finding the gated community. He rang the doorbell and a maid let him in. Leo's mother stood up from the sofa and said apologetically, "Mr. Evans, I'm so sorry. Leo isn't up yet." A setback right from the start. Ethan suddenly understood why Leo's mother had been so hesitant after accepting his application. It wasn't that she was afraid her son would disagree, but that she was afraid the tutor would give up. He waited in the living room for a full half hour before Leo reluctantly got out of bed and went to the dining room for breakfast. He was a boy who hadn't fully grown into his features yet, but he was very handsome. He was wearing black comic strip pajamas, probably not yet presented, his hair messy, his face still holding a bit of baby fat. But his eyes were cold and fierce, far beyond his years. A spoiled rich kid, clearly. He would probably present as an omega, Ethan thought absently. He didn't look at Ethan, and Ethan didn't care. He analyzed Leo's midterm and final exam papers to identify his weaknesses. But Leo immediately tried to assert his dominance. He pushed the papers and notebook aside, propped his chin on his hand, and said to Ethan, "If you want to make money, don't bother me. Just sit here every day. My mom will pay you on time." He sneered. "But if you make trouble, don't blame me for being rude." Ethan found it amusing. He suppressed a smile and said, "And how will you be rude?" Leo narrowed his eyes. His tone was like something out of a movie. He even raised an eyebrow and said fiercely, "I'll make your life very difficult." Ethan replied without batting an eye, "Okay." He sat there, alternating between looking at the exam papers and his phone, completely ignoring Leo, as if it were his own home. 10 minutes later, Leo coughed twice and asked tentatively, "You're really not going to teach me?" Ethan retorted, "Weren't you the one who told me not to?" Leo flopped back onto his bed. After another 10 minutes, Leo asked again, "You're just worried my mom will come in and see you playing on your phone instead of teaching me. Aren't you afraid she'll think you're irresponsible and not pay you?" Ethan turned a page in his book and said, "I'll still get paid for today, right? At worst, I just won't come back next time. It's not like you're my only student." Leo shot up, then fell back onto the bed in a huff, fuming. He kicked the blanket off the bed. Ethan ignored him. He spent the next 3 hours comfortably and contentedly playing on his phone. When the time was up, he got up and left, leaving Leo stunned in his room. Before leaving, Ethan told Leo's mother, "Mrs. Sterling, let's reschedule the next session for a day later. Please don't tell Leo yet." "Why? I have my methods. I guarantee he will listen," Ethan said. Mrs. Sterling seemed skeptical and smiled helplessly. "Getting him to listen is harder than climbing a mountain. He's only afraid of his cousin. He doesn't listen to anyone else, not even us. This must be tough for you, Mr. Evans. Don't feel too pressured." Ethan repeated, "He will listen. Trust me." The second time he came, Ethan sat down and started playing on his phone again. Leo walked in with a game controller, looked at Ethan sideways, and asked in a strange tone, "Why weren't you here yesterday?" Ethan put down his backpack. "Oh, another student needed urgent help with his schoolwork, so I rearranged my schedule." Leo pointed at himself in disbelief. "So you postponed my session to earn money from someone else?" Ethan said frankly, "Yes. You're not studying anyway. What's the difference between a day earlier or a day later?" Leo was furious, almost throwing his game controller. He had never been ignored like this in his life. The first time, this person had pretended to be scared of his threats but was actually unfazed, and had even played on his phone the entire time, completely ignoring him. And now he was saying this. "What kind of person are you? Get out. I don't want you to tutor me." Leo threw his alarm clock on the floor. Ethan calmly put his notebook back in his bag and said, "Okay, I'm leaving. Your mother said I get paid for each visit." "Thanks." Leo was even angrier, practically spitting blood. He blocked Ethan's way and glared at him. "In your dreams. You're not leaving." Ethan frowned. "What do you want?" Leo threw a tantrum, flailing on the bed. "I'm so sick of you tutors. I'm sick of it." The sharp screams filled the air. Ethan calmly took out his phone and scrolled through the news. He noticed the bedroom door was ajar, and someone seemed to be standing outside. He guessed it was Leo's mother and continued to look at his phone. "I won't let you get away with this." Leo glared at Ethan. Ethan replied nonchalantly. That day, Ethan spent the entire session on his phone, ignoring the raging Leo. The third time he came, the situation had improved. Leo wasn't playing games. He sat cross-legged on the bed, his face grim, in a standoff with Ethan. Ethan looked at him, then went back to reading bilingual news on his phone. Leo's face turned red with anger. The fourth time finally paid off. When Ethan entered the bedroom, Leo's mother said tactfully, "Mr. Evans, Leo has forgotten everything he learned over the winter break. Please tutor him diligently. Just playing on your phone isn't going to work." Ethan said, "Okay." Leo sneered from the side. "If you play on your phone again, you can get out." He even sat down at his desk and twirled a pen in his hand. His eyes were full of mischief, taking his mother's scolding of Ethan as a great victory. Ethan exchanged a look with Leo's mother and smiled almost imperceptibly. Spoiled children could be so naive. He took out the knowledge outline he had prepared and sighed, feigning helplessness. "All right, I'll review last semester's material with you." Leo was very pleased with his success. It wasn't until Ethan finished teaching that he realized something was wrong. Why was he listening so attentively? But he didn't want to make things easy for Ethan, so he had to keep listening. Ethan taught for an hour and a half straight and got thirsty. He took his mug and walked out of the bedroom. Mrs. Sterling and the maid were gone. Ethan had to find the kitchen himself.